Hello and welcome to this Institute for Government live public event on whether the government is making the right policy decisions on energy. My name is Alex Thomas and I'm a Programme Director at the IFG, and really pleased that you can all be joining us here today for this discussion. It's a crucial moment for energy policy. The government is facing any number of really significant decisions over the coming months and years. We had an energy white paper before Christmas. We also had the 6th carbon budget from the Committee on Climate Change. There are huge questions over new technologies, the future of nuclear policy, and how to decarbonise heat and power. And there are real questions over the extent to which the government is ready to face those challenges and address some of the trade-offs that are going to be necessary. So a really timely event. As I say, very pleased that you are all here to join us for this discussion. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so use the Q&A function that is available to submit your questions. Do say, if you can, who you are, where you're watching from, so that we get a sense of who the audience are. And I will remind you about that regularly throughout the event. Also, tweet along. We'll be tweeting at IFG events, and the hashtag is #IFG Energy for this event. We've got a brilliant panel to discuss the question. Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Professor Dame Julia King, who is Deputy Chair of the Climate Change Committee and Chair of the Carbon Trust. We'll be talking to Guy Newey, the Strategy and Performance Director at the Energy Systems Catapult and a former Special Advisor at the Department for Energy and Climate Change and at BEIS. Emma Pinchbeck, who is Chief Executive of Energy UK, and Will McDowall, who's a Senior Researcher at the Institute for Government, has been thinking about energy policy for a long time, published a report in December last year about the use of evidence in energy policy making. So welcome to all of them. Do get your questions coming in, and we're looking forward to a really good discussion. So I'll come to you, Baroness Brown, first. Julia, the 6th carbon budget, as I mentioned, published before Christmas, it makes clear just how big a challenge net zero will be. I mean, effectively, the 80% target has been brought forward 15 years to 2035. What do you think the most significant challenge, the biggest gap for government to overcome is to get us to where we need to be in those 15 years?
Thank you very much, Alex. Well, I wish there was just one gap I could deal with. So I'm going to make 4 points. I could go on and make quite a lot more, but I realise the time constraints. So my first point would be about delivery. We've got to move on from statements of policy and intent to actually delivering that policy and that intent. The 2020s really do have to be a decisive decade of progress if we're going to meet these targets. And of course, we've got to do that despite the huge extra challenges that are being put on everybody, and particularly on our civil servants, by dealing with COVID and by dealing with Brexit. But by 2030, we've got to have halved our oil use to be on track. We should be seeing a 35% reduction in gas use. We should be on the brink of the acceleration to double the size of the electricity system. And we should be seeing emissions getting onto a really rapidly accelerating downward path. So of course that will need investment. So my second point is about investment. Investment in net zero infrastructure is currently running at about 10 billion per annum. That needs to increase to 50 billion by 2030. It's a big increase, but of course it's only about 10% or so of the running annual investment of about 400 billion. However, we've got to make sure that net zero is embedded in every decision that government takes. My third point is about one of the most challenging areas, which is decarbonising our homes and buildings. That accounts for about 20% of our emissions, So it's one of the most important, but of course it's also the most challenging behaviourally and very challenging for policy. It's the area that needs most government funding as well. So government intervention is going to be absolutely key to getting it to happen. So it's great to hear the target of 600,000 heat pump installations by 2028, but news of chaos in the 2 billion Green Homes Grant scheme is not such good news. And my final point is about transport, 25% or so of our emissions, and actually creeping up in the last few years. We really have got to accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles. We're going to have a real challenge to address the move, to address and achieve a move back to public transport. Quite understandably, people have resorted to their own cars where they can because of the fear of COVID, and we've seen empty buses and trains. We've got to get people back to using public transport again. And of course, we've got to start trials of heavy transport to find out whether we can use electrification or whether we're going to need to be using hydrogen. So there's an enormous amount to do, but we really have to move from thinking and developing policy to actually making things happen on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was great, and a great sort of introduction to some of those trade-offs and reminding us about COVID and Brexit and the pressure that governments are under as well. I'm delighted we've already had our first question about the Cumbria coal mine and trade-offs there, so we'll no doubt come on to that in the questions. But I'll turn now to Guy. Julia highlighted there, and we know some of the sort of huge technological challenges here. This is also a government and a prime minister who are prone to big ambition on and kind of grand projects. Offshore wind, hydrogen, the air sector, green ships, carbon capture, all of those will be heavily reliant on bringing new projects to the market at scale and developing that technology. Are we in a good place to do this? Is the government guilty of relying too much on that sort of techno optimism I mentioned? And how fit do you think the government is to make the right choices on technology? Guy.
So, well, we need some grand ambitions on technology. It's worth pausing for a moment and just saying we've had some incredible successes in the last 10 years. Offshore wind always gets rolled out. It's worth reminding ourselves that it was almost kind of killed 5 years ago as part of some of the clawbacks on the green stuff. Electric vehicles, huge success story. You know, you can see a big consumer pull for that. So, what are the areas where we do need? We need some activity and we need some of that optimism to turn into reality. So, you know, there is a long list. Julia was rightly cutting down her list, and I'll rattle through a few of them. Nuclear, you know, we need to get we need to make that more straightforward to power plants and learn from the successes of elsewhere. Areas we don't talk enough about: agriculture, bioenergy, negative emissions, industrial processes. You know, how we're going to get cement and steel all made in low carbon ways. But the one I'm going to highlight, jumping on what Julia said, is about heat and buildings. And that's not actually a tech challenge in the same way. We often get kind of obsessed with technologies in this debate for all sorts of good reasons, but actually, you know, to a certain extent, some of the technology exists. We need to do some innovation around and some demonstration around some of the potential around hydrogen. But there are technologies which exist and can be ready and used today. But the innovation that we need, the progress we need, is about how we make it easy for people to switch to low carbon heating, and that's about, you know, where the costs should fall, but that's also about thinking about business models, areas where we don't spend enough time thinking about innovation policy generally. How do we make it really easy? You don't have to go on some kind of grand designs epic mission to put a heat pump into your home, which for people who are kind of confronting it at the moment, if we want to get it to 600,000, that's what we're going to have to focus on. And of course, none of this is going to happen without policy. Look, I'm all for plenty of support for the innovation sector. Indeed, I've got quite a strong vested interest working for an innovation agency thinking about that. But in order, you don't get offshore wind down from £150 a megawatt hour to £40 a megawatt hour in a lab. Demonstration facilities, test facilities are essential as part of that, but you need scale. And the innovators we talk to all the time, they constantly say, right, what I need is a market to be able to sell into. And that's certainly the case with heat and other areas. So what kind of policy challenge you need to think up? We need to get the set of economic incentives right. They're a bit of a mess, carbon incentives across the economy at the moment. Some areas got really strong incentives to decarbonize. Some areas are actually subsidizing pollution. Guess which areas we're doing really well in. You need to think about what the markets are going to be for some of the changing technology. If you've got a much windier system, that's going to require a different set of market arrangements from what we have now. And then on top of that, you need targeted innovation support in particular areas. And government really needs to think about where it should be focusing on that. Thankfully, some of the work the government's done over the last few years around energy innovation needs assessments gives them a really good starting point of what are the big innovation questions, the kind of the things that are kind of 10, 15 years away that they need to work on. Because the time between now and 2050 is nothing in energy technology terms. Most energy technologies kind of take decades to kind of come to fruition. The one exception to that, which is really exciting, is kind of where the digital technology can speed up some of these areas, and that's an area of real potential that again we've got to think through what the implications would be. But that's about government, organising itself in the right way as well. Some of the excellent reports that the Institute has done looking at this, the characteristic of net zero requires a lot of central coordination. That's not about central planning, that's not about reinventing the CGB, but it does mean that there has to be a set of structures where decisions are made quickly. And I, having been involved in clean growth strategy, I would have killed if we had two cabinet committees who were driving this. You really need that kind of central grip. And the other strategic question is that balance between local government. The CCC report was excellent on highlighting this issue. We've been pushing it for a long time. We've got 250, 300 climate emergencies across the UK declared by local authorities. Not many of them have a serious plan to deal with that. How do we get them resourced thinking about this properly in a powerful way? And that's how you unlock the kind of change that we need, that Julia set out over the next 10 years.
That's great. Thanks, Guy. Energising urgency, but also a sense of the scale of the challenge there. We've got loads of questions coming in already, so do keep questions coming in, and I will rattle through as many of them as I can. But moving on to Emma now. Julia mentioned COVID. I was also struck that a big theme of the Sixth Carbon Budget and the CCC report was fairness. And we're already seeing an exacerbation of inequalities in the UK because of the coronavirus crisis. Do you think the government is doing enough to think about and ensure fairness for consumers in the energy system? And what do you think the kind of sort of long-term structural risks are if the government doesn't get that right? Oh, I think we've lost Emma. Hopefully we'll get Emma back imminently, but let's move on to Will first. I'll save that question for Emma because I'm interested in what she's thinking, what she thinks about it. But Will, you've been looking at the UK's capacity for policy making for decision making in energy policy, and particularly about how well the government uses evidence to make those decisions. Can you talk us through a bit about the work that we've been doing in recent months that tells us about how the government makes those decisions and how it uses evidence in particular?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as Guy said, lots of the challenges here require government to work, require us to think about how government works, how government's organised. We've looked in particular at how government uses evidence, and clearly that's not the only ingredient in policy making. Obviously, the political drive, some of the organizational structures, etc., are also important. But if you don't have good evidence, and if you're not building policies on good evidence, you're likely to go badly wrong. So we looked internationally. We compared the UK and how the British government uses evidence compared to a few comparators. And actually, the picture's pretty good, I think, overall, that BEIS has a lot of things to feel good about, particularly around energy modelling, really strong internal modelling capacity when compared to comparator countries. And obviously, in the Climate Change Committee has a genuinely world-leading advisory institution for the kind of big strategic picture. But we also identified quite a few ways in which the UK government isn't using evidence as effectively as it could. And I think they boil down to a set of issues around having rather narrow perspectives sometimes. So not engaging widely enough, not always engaging international examples, not engaging academia effectively. And some of the processes within government, things like the impact assessment, drive a lot of the evidence collection and focus around value for money and cost benefit, rather than some of the issues that both Guy and Julia talked about, which are around delivery, understanding the real nitty gritty of how to build stuff, how to deliver it, how to deploy it, and the householder decisions around things like installing heat pumps or retrofit, and some of those kind of real world challenges that need engineering expertise, social research, have been a bit neglected. And looking internationally, we can see some examples of how other countries do sometimes draw more effectively on evidence from outside sources, from external sources, either because, like Germany, they've got a political system that relies much more on consensus building. So you have lots of different political actors throwing each other's evidence at each other. And through that process, you get a greater diversity of perspectives. Or because, like in the Netherlands, you've got independent institutions that are knowledge-based and are providing expertise into government, like the CCC does, but at a finer grain of detail. So kind of picking through impact assessments and really getting into the policy nitty-gritty on really specific policies in a much more detailed way. So, our conclusion basically is that government's getting quite a lot right, but the challenges of net zero means it needs to do a lot better. And we've seen plenty of examples of policies that have not done well, in part because of weak evidence use. I mean, I think the Green Deal is the totemic example. And so we think government needs to do more to engage externally. Part of the answer to that, we think, is supporting external organizations that can advise government, things like the Energy System Catapult, so keeping Guy happy, and the UK Energy Research Centre, but also ensuring greater scrutiny of policy, so beefing up things like the Regulatory Policy Committee, which can be an extremely dry kind of regulatory process, but provides scrutiny on policies as they develop and can help ensure that government is testing evidence as it goes through and as it builds policy development. So I was really encouraged actually in the white paper to see a whole chapter on energy modelling. And as a former energy modeler, as someone with a background in that area, I was delighted, because I think it's that kind of initiative to open up evidence building is so important, because otherwise, however expert BEIS is, it can't do this by itself. It can't do all the thinking alone. It needs to be better at opening up some of that thinking and that evidence collection to a wide range of perspectives.
Brilliant. Thank you, Will. Really comprehensive tour around those issues there. Have we got Emma back? It's a hazard of these things. Emma, are you there? I'm not sure we do. So while we're still trying to get Emma back, no, I shall ask. I trailed the question about the Cumbria coal mine, and we've got a question from Nick Bowman, which simply asks: does the new Cumbria coal mine suggest the government is not truly serious about decarbonising the economy? I know the CCC has had views on this. So, Julia, do you want to kick off on that question, and then I might ask Guy what you make of it.
Well, I'm happy to kick off on that. In fact, we wrote a letter to the minister at the end of last week to express our concern from the CCC about the planning permission for the new coal mine. I think we do need to recognise that it's a coking coal mine. It's not power station coal. So it's actually for steel, primarily for steel making. But the planning request for the coal mine did say that I think something like 80% of the coal it produces will be for export. So it's not even as if we need all of this coal for our own steel making processes. So the CCC sixth carbon budget and net zero pathway recognizes that we won't be using coal for generating electricity by 2024. That'll all have gone, and by 2035, industry like steelmaking will need to be decarbonised. So if we are still using coal in steelmaking, it will have to be with carbon capture and storage with very high capture rates. But it may well be by then that we've moved to using hydrogen in steelmaking, and there's a lot of interest, certainly in Europe, in replacing using hydrogen for the reduction processes in steel, which would get rid of the need for coking coal. So why you would give this coal mine planning permission out to 2049, which is what has been granted just in the run-up to COP, is something we don't understand and we think sends an extremely negative message.
Thanks, Julia. And Guy, it looks like we've got Emma back, so I'll come to you in a moment, Emma, which is brilliant news. But before we do that, Guy, does it tell us something about the trade-offs? I mean, is this a government that's really going to take those trade-offs seriously enough, do you think?
So well, time will tell more broadly. I mean, on the specifics of the permission in Cumbria, the important challenge is how are we going to get the innovation necessary in steel making, so that by the dates that Julia set out, we're able to create low carbon steel, and we've got that in some processes related to steel. It's to do with on the electricity side, but we're certainly going to need other areas, and hydrogen has a huge potential. But then that's got to be seen in the round. How are you then protecting steelmakers in the UK? What's the potential role for border carbon tariffs? All of those issues have to be considered in the round, and of course we get fixated on a particular decision, and it's right. But what we need is a kind of a robust plan for the transition of steel to low carbon.
Thanks, Guy. And Will, you've talked a bit about the challenges of cross-government decisions like this. Have you got any thoughts on the Cumbria mine? And then Emma, I will come to you.
Well, I think it's a pretty clear case. I mean, it was fairly obvious that BEIS were not thrilled by the decision, and it's a pretty clear case of what IFG's talked about in its net zero work, that BEIS doesn't have the clout across government to drive all of the net zero decisions that need to be taken. And that really begs questions about if BEIS doesn't have the clout, then who does? It's a kind of prime ministerial level set of objectives, and we need to ensure that there is greater power at the centre to coordinate some of these net zero issues, because these trade-offs will come up. They've come up here in the case of this coal mine. They'll come up again around regulation of buildings and concerns about whether building regs will drive up costs of new build, etc. So we really need to ensure that we've got the clout at the centre to kind of ensure that departments are aligned around the priority of net zero, rather than leaving it to BEIS, who are not strong enough always to drive that across government.
So we've made several IFG reports recommending stronger centre and more central coordination in dealing with trade-offs around net zero. But now, as much trail, Emma, sorry about the connection.
I hate technology. Don't let anyone tell you that I'm a fan of a technology revolution.
Inequality and the importance of addressing inequality.
Or more broadly, it's the kind of how do people fit into this? I'm struck. We've kind of spent most of the conversation so far talking about the technology roadmap to deliver net zero, as we should, because certainly whole system change is how we're going to do this. But there are individuals on the other end of the system. And I was struck by the Energy White Paper for two reasons, just aesthetically. Firstly, the consumers chapter was up front. So people at the heart of what's coming in energy policy and net zero. And the second thing was that there was a picture of a house on the front of the document, which is not what you'd have got in old school energy policy publications before. It wasn't, for example, pylons or a power station. And that tells you about where we're going with energy policy over the next couple of decades. And I think the kind of flagship announcement in the white paper and a key theme coming through it was this idea of I think they called it a strategic dialogue between government and customers and the industry to look at who pays for the transition and kind of fairness and equity. And if there was a theme in the white paper other than net zero, it was that. And for the energy sector, I think what that means is twofold. Firstly, we're looking for a policy and regulatory landscape that means that our customers, the media, politicians, others see the costs that are on energy bills to fund the transition as fair. And the second thing that we're looking for is a recognition in policy that captures this move from a relationship between the industry and customers as being quite a passive one to one where in a net zero system we're going to have much more active customers, many more actors, more competition, and having to do the things that we already do, like take care of vulnerable people. And that's very, very important if you think about where decarbonisation is going, which is into heat and transport and areas of the economy which are innately much more personal and feel much more and are much more disparate. So getting the right mechanism for the right kind of person is going to be key. I mean, you asked about bills and fairness, and let's start there. I think Baroness Brown and others have already said the energy transition is fundamentally a capex problem, and we're going to have to invest hugely in the next decade for to get the benefits of decarbonisation by 2050. It's a kind of an upfront investment, that 50 billion, and we also need to unlock private capital to do it. So 2/3 of that investment is expected to come from industry. And what that basically means is if we continue to do it through energy bills, where customers already pick up a disproportionate amount of the cost of decarbonisation and where bills can be regressive, that you can see that preventing investment in the private market and making innovation more difficult, but B, potentially being a problem if we're having to do a lot of that, if there are a lot of costs coming in the short term to get the long-term benefits back. So I think the government's analysis on energy policy and where we're going needs to really understand costs, needs to keep them off bills as much as possible, actually. But then also be clear on where, if we're investing in things through bills, where the benefits come back. And we've mentioned offshore wind. I mean, we've got a booming UK industry which is providing cheaper electricity off the back of that investment. We're not always very good at making that case or thinking that through. In terms of COVID, the industry has been trying to do an awful lot for consumers. As you'd imagine, we're an essential service. We've got essential workers. There's already the price cap on bills, which means that the vulnerable customers or those in kind of standard tariffs are protected. But there's been further agreement in the short term between government and suppliers to pick up additional support for customers on things like prepayment meters. So there's a kind of this short-term action going on. I'd argue that the equity and bills point there is about more long-term stuff, and in particular, investing in the building stock to make sure that we're using less energy seems like a good way to go. So we've got Eco and the Warm Homes Discount. Those are funded by energy suppliers through, in the form of an obligation. The government's own fuel poverty advisors have said that they're not sufficient. And again, they're funded on bills. So there's a conversation to be had there. We've talked about the Green Homes Grant, and there's been an increase to universal credit. But these are, again, all quite short-term piecemeal things, and they don't really grasp the scale of what's coming in terms of decarbonisation. And, one of the things we argue for is a massive, infrastructure scale rollout of energy efficiency measures, which will help not just vulnerable customers, but all customers. And then, lastly, and perhaps most importantly, Guy touched upon it, that's still quite an old-fashioned way of thinking about energy. It's, the typical relationship with a customer and just use less. And it's right that we do that. But I don't think we're being anywhere near imaginative enough about the relationship between customers and their energy in future. And some of the best things that we know retailers can do for all consumers, particularly vulnerable ones, is invest in things like really good communication, in thinking about energy services and much more broadly about the service they offer to customers. So things like helping them, access EVs, helping them access heat pumps in the future, helping them with smart meters get control of their energy use. We could be doing much more interesting and innovative things with customer data to make sure we're looking after all the demographics in the energy system. And our regulation is nowhere near catching up with that reality, let alone a world where customers can do things like load shift on the grid, or will be using their own technologies in their homes to provide grid services. So to do that, I'd argue that we need to be looking much more at markets to get price signals right, so we can get innovative, new business models and new energy services away, because that's in the long-term interests of customers. And lastly, I have stood on this soapbox in every job I've been in for the last decade, so why not do it here? The government never, ever thinks about engagement first. They think about policy first and technology, and they never think about kind of behaviour change and the people that it hits in terms of policy until the last minute. So, one of my favourite examples is that we spent almost nothing on communications for the renewable heat incentive, which is fundamentally a policy getting customers to invest in an unusual form of heating and receive a payback for it. And I think we need to be much, much, much better at doing that over the coming decade. And we have seen from the success of the Climate Assembly that if you really do engage people with complex policy decisions, they often come back recommending firmer measures than we would have anticipated. So we've got a good case study for doing that now. There you go. Hope that was worth the trial.
Definitely. No, that was great. Thanks, Emma. And you've got agreement from Jeremy Nicholson in the comments and questions. Emma's right. Government needs to consider how heat decarbonisation can be supported through general taxation to mitigate the impact of policy costs on consumer business energy bills. I was also going to highlight a question, I think you've covered it, Emma, to some extent, but from Philip Johnson, who asks about fuel poverty. What about fuel poverty? The increased costs of all the decarbonisation will lead to increased prices in real terms, or will we get lower prices? Do you think there's anything particular about, Emma, on fuel poverty? I think, as I say, you touched on something.
So I think, as I've said, that's still a group that the retailers are obligated to and already kind of look to support through. There's various different schemes and policy instruments on bills designed specifically to tackle that. Again, already the government's own advisors suggest that they are not big enough to really help. So there's kind of targeted instruments we could still look at there. More broadly, though, this is about the kind of the cost of decarbonisation, how it falls across the economy as a whole, right? So if we got that right, and if you can make the markets work, that the retailers can step in and invest their own capital in getting some of these new technologies away, then I think you might find that the costs fall more fairly. And that's what hopefully the government is getting at when they're talking about this strategic dialogue. But I think it isn't just a BEIS conversation and focused on energy. It's got to be how do we fund a whole economy shift, and our energy bill still the right place to do it? And if they are we clear about the benefits overall to people, and do we fully understand who's paying for things up front? So I know it's not a specific answer because we haven't done the analysis, but that's where government needs to go. It needs to be much bigger in how it's thinking about this.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. There's a question about the slightly different area, the regulatory framework, which, Julia, I might ask you to comment on first, but it's from Sissy Liu. I hope I've pronounced your name right, but asking, the energy regulatory framework is rigid. How would you like to see government flex to facilitate anticipatory net zero investment? Julia, have you got anything to comment on?
That's certainly a good point. We do need to see much more in the way of anticipatory net zero investment, and I think we are seeing Ofgem, the regulator, starting to look at how can we make the right kind of things happen with their new suggestion that parts of the system need to be separated away from the network providers, because the network providers would like more network and more electricity, because that gives more shareholder return. And actually we want a smart and really flexible electricity system, ideally with as little electricity as possible in it, and that's not necessarily what will drive the network providers. And the same is very much true at the distribution network level. I mean, I happen to chair the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority Independent Climate Commission, and we've got real challenges there with councils trying to do quite innovative things, linking solar farms to local off-gas grid communities to try and put electrical heating, community-based electrical heating systems in to replace their oil-based heating, and real frustrations with that interface with connecting up to the distribution system, which would be solved if the distribution system providers were looking at making the right kinds of investments in upgrading the grid ahead of time, rather than waiting for each request and then coming up with a huge cost that then makes the project look like there's no opportunity to have any payback on it. So absolutely, it's a very appropriate question, a very appropriate point, and I do think we need more movement in this area.
Thanks, Julia. Will, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, just, I mean, really to echo Julia's point, I mean, I think regulatory agility is, something that is incredibly important when you have a major transition with new technologies emerging. I mean, I was recently talking to UPS, the logistics company. They had real trouble upgrading their fleet of delivery vehicles in London to electric vehicles because of the limitations on the local distribution grid. And they ended up having to buy and pay for the distribution grid upgrade assets, but those assets, they weren't able to own them. So they paid for an asset that's then owned by the local distribution company. And that's not a position that a company likes to be in, to pay for someone else's assets. But the regulatory system was too inflexible. And there's countless other examples like that, of where the nitty-gritty of technological change is slowed down by regulatory inflexibility. So I think, Ofgem's been working quite hard at things like regulatory sandboxes, etc. But all of this stuff needs a lot of thinking to enable new technologies to be tested and developed, and that requires quite a lot of work.
Thanks, Will. Guy, we've had a few questions, as you might expect, about new nuclear. So interested in your thoughts on this. Tom Railton, do we have to accept that government will need to directly fund new nuclear to bring down costs? And how important is it that fast decisions are made on this to preserve nuclear skills? Another about stressing the advantages of nuclear, smart and super grid. So Guy, what's your take on that?
So it's been a question that's kind of been festering in energy policy for the last decade or so, and we've obviously got one new power station coming online at Hinkley, but we've got potentially quite a few coming off. I mean, nuclear has obviously characteristics where the state is going to have a heavy involvement, but in some ways the policy we've kind of designed gives it tries to see that it's going to be all delivered in the market, and so putting a lot of pressure, and so we're kind of in these contortions to try and come up with financing structures that work for people. I think the starting point question is, how do we make nuclear maintain its high safety levels, and how do we make it cheap? How do we actually get it on the cost reduction curve that we've seen with other technologies? And guess what? The countries that have done that, South Korea and other words, have done it on a programmatic way. You do one, you learn from it, and you build another one. You get those benefits to learning. But we, in the past, and this is not just a kind of recent thing, this is history of nuclear policy since 1950s. We've kind of done it in a series of bespoke reactors, and every time thought we'll try and invent something new. But that's going to take the government to really think about how you can do it in a programmatic way. But nuclear, if it doesn't kind of see that as a serious challenge, and that's a challenge for the industry as much as government, and certainly people in the industry do see this as a challenge, you're seeing the competition, whether it's offshore wind, etc., falling in costs the whole time, and so the case, we still see it as very strong for nuclear, but the case gets weaker and weaker. But of course, if cost reduction was able to happen, then and that's financing, that's about build, then we'd be in a much better position. But that needs quite strong coordination, probably more than any other technology.
Thanks, Guy. Does anybody else want to come in on new nuclear? Here's your chance. Emma.
I can't. I think Guy's right. It's been 10 years of talking about it. I mean, there are two things to say. One, it's in the CCC pathways. So if we don't do new nuclear, then we have to figure out something else to close the gap. That I haven't yet seen a net zero pathway that is a 100% renewables led net zero pathway, and the reasons for that are about things like grid physics mainly, but also the costs of running the system from intermittency, and relatedly because a lot of that would have to come from offshore wind, and there's a kind of geographic constraint where you put it. So it's most of the cost-effective pathways to do net zero have nuclear in. Now they might have 1 to 2 nuclear power stations, but it's still in there. The other technologies to close that gap where we think it starts to get expensive for renewables are also things like, having CCUS, which are other early stage technologies that we don't have yet and would have to invest in. And so it's a challenge from a systems point of view. From a policy point of view, it's about the funding model, as Guy says, and the kind of public-private partnership in that. And the Energy White Paper did take things a step forward. They said they'd try and get to final investment decision on, a nuclear power plant by the end of this Parliament. But it's that bit on, I suppose, how much of a stake the government's going to take that is missing, and that's where they need to kind of sharpen their thinking.
Thanks, Emma. Julia, what do you think? And we've also this discussion has prompted a number of points about tidal. What about tidal power? So, Julia.
Well, I was just going to point out that in our sort of core scenario for the 6th carbon budget and for net zero, we have about 80% renewable generation by 2050. But if you actually look at the makeup of the electricity system, it's still very diverse. Although a huge chunk of that generation is renewable, the huge majority is renewables, huge chunk of that is wind, and a lot of that's offshore wind. When you actually look at what's on the system, there is still nuclear, there is still things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There's also hydrogen in gas turbines able to do peak lopping or to come on when the wind isn't blowing. So it's a really quite diverse system still. It's not just a renewable system, as Emma was saying. And tidal, the only reason why we don't have tidal in our system for the in the CCC models is simply cost, and that we haven't seen a convincing pathway that will deliver dramatic cost reductions for tidal. But if that appears, then it will get incorporated into our pathways, because we're always looking to see how can we do this at the lowest the lowest possible cost to the consumer and to the country. And we need more broadband rather than more roads.
It sounds like Alex has dropped off, so I might step in. I don't have access to the questions that are coming in, but first of all, I think on this question of tidal, I think clearly marine technologies, wave and tidal, have just proved to be more difficult to bring the costs down and to make work effectively than people 10 years ago had hoped, which is a real shame, because obviously tidal is much more reliable than wind, and much more forecastable. So I think that's it's just a real challenge. Getting that kind of cost reduction is really difficult. There's a question here, a perhaps pointed question from the audience about whether the same research effort has been devoted to tidal as has been to nuclear. I think the answer is clearly no. as far as I'm aware. I mean, I think the real challenge there is that getting cost reductions and durability in tidal has been about supporting early development of prototypes. And yeah, I mean, arguably, it does make sense to fund that R&D more, but I think there's big questions about scale up and speeds of deployment.
There's a couple of questions about actually renewables costs in. I think it's worth, so there's a bigger question at stake here, which might be interesting given this is about energy policy, and that's about the kinds of infrastructure we're investing in. So nuclear, into a certain extent, tidal, if it's lagoons rather than arrays, tend to be bespoke projects at the moment. And that's Guy's point about you get cost reductions when things can be serialized. And someone's asked about, how are we sure about renewables costs? Are you taking the whole life cycle costs into consideration? The answer is yes. And one of the reasons renewables was able to scale up, scale down so quickly, scale up in volume, scale down in prices, that we could serialize them. So we could do the manufacturing really quickly. The sites are similar-ish when we go to build them. We got better at operations and maintenance. That will change a bit as we go out into deeper waters, but it's still pretty clear that, again, we'll come down the learning curve and the costs will reduce. With tidal's a much earlier stage technology, and I used to work on it, and their problem has been a lack of a route to market. So generally in this country, we're quite good at investing in R&D for technologies, but we're less good at then seizing them and scaling them up. We have historically let that happen in other markets and then pick them up further down the development curve. And if we're interested in tidal, there's an argument that the UK really should, give it a route to market and see if they can start doing this serialization with arrays. With lagoons, just as with nuclear, they're likely to need something a bit different than like a CFD or an auction or a route to market in that way, because they're bespoke projects. And when we look at the net zero challenge, there are some things in the economy which are going to require that kind of infrastructure investment and thinking, just as there are some technologies and infrastructure that can probably get away if the government just gets the framework right and allows the market to innovate within it. And we have a kind of competitive marketplace. And that is the thinking we need government to do. They need to step back and think about which technologies we want to own the industrial footprint for here in the UK and bring from R&D through to development, which ones they're going to give a competitive route to market for and allow private industry to really do, and which ones might require a different kind of investment. We need them for strategic reasons, like, for example, filling the bit of the system that we're not sure renewables can do. So, I mean, that's a big answer to some of the questions in there, but it does answer why there's been a difference between how we've treated things like tidal, nuclear and renewables, and why the costs are a bit different. Lots of tidal fans on the chat.
Yeah, thanks Emma. I think you've all proved the unnecessariness of having a chair there. So thank you for jumping in when my internet connection went down. Apologies. I was going to ask, as you said, Emma, lots of fans of tidal, but another big subject area raised by Nick Bowman, asking whether the government should be looking more at carbon trading schemes to encourage move from carbon-based energy, and whether that might also help levelling up. So anybody got any thoughts on carbon trading? Guy, I might pick on you first.
So this goes back to the. I mean, it depends exactly what you mean by carbon trading here, and I'm not quite sure how you get levelling up in there as well. It sounds like one scheme to solve lots of the world's problems. I think the important thing on carbon incentives across the economy, as I said in my talk, is that we need that you need to get the set of economic incentives right across the economy. And if you are looking at aviation or domestic heating or commercial heating, then effectively we are subsidizing pollution. Now, I'm not one, partly for political economy reasons, who just thinks, well, of course, the answer is we just put in a carbon tax across the whole economy and off we go. I know that's the most elegant solution, but I think the political economy of that is extremely difficult. So it's going to require, for different sectors, recognizing international competitiveness and other issues, it's going to require a different set of solutions. And some of that will be regulatory, some of that will be pricing, some of that will be subsidies to move forward. But we need to think about those particular areas. The areas where you probably got the strongest case for carbon trading and getting some mechanism in place is around the link between areas where it looks very difficult to find answers by 2050. So aviation, for example, lots of exciting innovations happening, but to replace it at scale, what are they then paying for at the other end, either in industrial decarbonisation or in negative emissions, etc.? How do you get those two joined up so you're confident about negative emissions and the industries that are very hard to offset are being offset in the right way?
I think I'm going to disagree slightly with the last thing that Guy said there. Just looking at the experience of innovation that's been driven by carbon markets around the world over the last couple of decades, and just echoing his point about political economy, it's proven really difficult to get carbon prices high enough, either through carbon taxes. If you put carbon taxes too high, you get riots, as recently in France with the Gilets jaunes. And it's proven very difficult to get carbon trading systems to have a tight enough cap to drive prices high. And the result of that is that the innovation impacts of carbon prices have tended to be relatively incremental, and they've pushed technologies once they're already closer to maturity, and they've pushed more incremental efficiency type innovations, rather than seeding the kind of investments in more radical new technologies that we need in areas like aviation. So I'm a fan of carbon prices. I think they're really important, but I think you can't rely on them to drive the kinds of investment signals in radical new technologies, because that's often very high risk, and people tend to expect carbon prices not to rise for historically good reasons. So I think for those more radical technologies, you do need more dedicated early market support and regulation.
Julia, it'd be great to get your take on this.
Just on a very small part of this, and it picks up really on something that Emma was saying about the fairness part of this. In terms of tackling the decarbonisation of Britain's homes, we've got to move a lot of them over to much better insulation and then electric heating. And at the moment, and Guy has alluded to this too, and at the moment we have this, I think, ridiculous system that we have no carbon price on the gas we use to heat our homes, and yet we've loaded all of the costs of decarbonising our power system onto the electricity. So we've got to deal with that before we start trying to move lower income families onto electric heating. We need to reverse that and be using the carbon price on the gas to be able to subsidise the electric heating that we're going to need for so many homes to get us to net zero.
There's a linked point there in the questions from Dan Tagg. He asks, retro upgrading the UK's housing stock will take a generation. Why is the UK government so averse to tackling this at the scale required? This links a little bit to some of the sort of Whitehall machinations that Will referred to earlier, and the strength of Bayes vis-a-vis other departments, I suspect. But Emma, you look like you want to come in on that one.
I'll give you there's a political answer, which is that politicians, as Guy said at the beginning of this, politicians are always risk averse about going into people's homes, and particularly, I mean, it's funny and not funny, but if you poll the British public, they are much more reticent to have anything done to their homes than almost any other area of the economy. There's something about the kind of not wanting government's intrusion in the choices that you make about your home, and so politicians are wary of it for very simple, they get elected reasons. So there's that, and this is the point about twofold why you want people who can make that attractive, because that investment means new services for you and your family, and lower bills, and can kind of, so the energy retailers being able to package these technologies and offer you new services, that's why that's important. But the second thing is that government needs to communicate the benefits of doing this and then invest in it at scale, and because that would drive a virtuous circle. In terms of why they don't then invest in kind of fiscal policy and things in the economy, that generally speaking, if you look at impact assessments for energy efficiency policy, the costs and benefits don't really stick in the same place, because it's an upfront investment often from bills, but the benefits accrue to the householder. And that, that's particularly important for things like private rental, where a renter might be getting the benefits of lower energy bills, but the cost of the investment might accrue to the landlord or a local authority or elsewhere. And I think there's something about how we, bigger picture, think about the investment in what is fundamentally a net zero energy technology, and then the benefits that come back to the economy, so that we feel more confident about putting the capital in to deliver at scale. And just finally on this point, that often means that we have to think more imaginatively across Whitehall. With energy efficiency, one of the big benefits back to the economy isn't just about reduced energy bills or making heat pumps work effectively, so delivering on our net zero challenge. It's also that we get fewer respiratory illnesses because people are living in warmer, comfortable homes, and that's a healthcare saving to the NHS. And there have been various policy trials where we've done things like use local NHS commissioning budgets to fund insulation or boiler installs, because they've seen such a big saving to the local NHS from emissions from people like me who have asthma living in insufficient properties. So again, this is about how we fund the transition across government and getting that right. It is about looking at things like whether we should be funding it through electricity bills for such a whole economy challenge. But lastly, it's also about communicating the benefits to the public so that the politicians overall feel more comfortable about being ambitious.
Thanks, Emma. We're coming to the last sort of 5 minutes, so any final questions, do keep them coming in. But I was going to ask a sort of open question to each of the panel, really, to reflect on some of those trade-offs and the kind of communications and the sort of political salesmanship challenge, sales challenge, if you like. If you were the government now, what would you prioritise? What would your kind of strategy be for taking these sorts of decisions over the coming years? Guy, do you want to have a go at that?
Sorry, Alex, taking the strategy be on political communications
changing the dial politically is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah,
I know that's happened already, but what's the next step on that?
So I think I always see it as a kind of as a kind of dance that you're trying to do between innovation and your policy signals and your wider communications. So government took a politically brave decision just before Christmas to say that they're going to stop the sale of ICEs by 2030, 2035. What allowed them to do that? Well, the fact there's lots of electric cars which are quite desirable on the road. It's much harder 10 years ago when you have G-whizzes toppling over corners, going around the place. And so that's what it's you have to be thinking about. If you're talking about heat and buildings, for example, well, what is the set of propositions which actually makes it attractive and easy for people to install energy efficiency, to install low carbon heating. At the same time, you have to be thinking about the wider political communications. And I don't mean this in the kind of big P, should it be 80% by 2032, which is the kind of debate we have here. I mean, kind of proper retail politics, thinking about what is actually going to work and why the Citizens' Assembly was such a useful innovation in that area. But we need those conversations to go on. So I'm going to be totally unsatisfactory and say it doesn't work if you just do one. If you just did a political campaign, but there's no decent products out there, it wouldn't work. If you just had decent products and the background hasn't changed and 47% of people still don't realise that their boiler is contributing to climate change, then you're in real trouble.
Thanks, Guy. Julia, do you agree with that? What do you think about it? And the other interesting question to me I was going to ask you is whether you think there are other bits of the sort of policy making architecture in government that could learn from the experience of the CCC and the structure that's in place there.
Well, first of all, I'd like to follow on from what Guy was saying, because I really do think that if we could make some real progress in the building heat challenge before the COP, it would be a very, very positive step forward. And Guy has mentioned the disaster that the Green Deal was, and unless the Green Homes grant is sorted out very quickly, I think the reputation of that is going to be incredibly negative as well. So the building heat problem is a really big one. But before we deal with the heat, of course, we have to deal with the insulation. So The other one that the other area that I think, and I should just say that, dealing with that in a cross-government kind of systems way, it seems to me it's a fantastic opportunity for retraining and job creation. And we are going to have a real need for that with the impacts of COVID on unemployment. There's a real opportunity for creating really good jobs and skilled jobs if we get the training in place to support that. And of course, because what we're doing is reducing the import of fossil fuels, we actually take money that we were sending abroad to buy fossil fuels and we're investing it in the UK population, and they're going to become taxpayers, and that's kind of win-win-win for the UK economy. And the other thing that I would really like to give a shout out for is green space and planting trees, and the value of green space and tree planting for people's well-being, but of course also as a key element of the of achieving net zero through absorbing CO2 emissions and giving us those negative emissions. But actually, I'd also like to add the additional benefits you can get in the right place in flood alleviation, in terms of shading your cities, taking the temperature down, reducing the urban heat island effect, which is going to get worse because of climate change. So that's also somewhere where we can create jobs very quickly, and we can do something which really people can see is really adding immediate value and quality of life for them. And that's something I'd like to see us really getting on with as well.
Thanks, Julia. That's great. We're at our time now, but really quickly, any sort of final words? I can see Emma plus guest. If you do want to come in on that, and then
you might be more coherent. I think someone said it at the very beginning of this, which is that we've got now pretty good intent from government, ambitious, 10-point plan for the Prime Minister, an energy white paper, the 6th carbon budget, and an NDC. So we've got all the roadmaps in the world for the next couple of decades. What we lack is the implementation, and I think what would help government do that twofold. One, look at where the costs of this are falling in the economy, which they've started, but we think needs to be much more ambitious, and there've been loads of ideas on that today. And the second thing, which we've talked about less, is looking at the institutions that can deliver this. So do we have the right institutions in the energy sector and across government to get this job done? And do they have the right responsibilities to allow things like, flexible innovation, or to take decisions on where, we need bigger bits of infrastructure and so on. So I know that sounds high level, but if you get those right, then everything else will flow from it.
Thanks, Emma. Will, final thought?
Well, I agree with all of the above. And I think Guy's point about politics is the art of the possible, and innovation moves what is possible. So I think that interaction between innovation, the industrial strategy dimensions of energy, giving people jobs in the transition, etc., all of that is really crucial for maintaining consent and for enabling that kind of continued development between new technologies, new ways of doing things, and people's willingness to do it. So and I quite agree. I think with buildings, we've just had this stop-start approach for far too long, and we need to think about buildings as a long-term transformation. It's not just about the new technologies, it's about innovation across the supply chain and the industry, and that needs to be supported with a much longer term perspective. So hopefully the heat and building strategy that's forthcoming will do precisely that.
Brilliant. Thank you. And on that note, we're a minute over, so we will draw it to a close there. Thank you to a brilliant panel. Really appreciated your contributions. Thank you to everybody for all the questions that you've sent in. There'll be a recording of this event up on our website and podcast on the IFG live stream in the next 24 hours or so. And the final thing I was going to do is, if you're interested in this sort of subject, you should be interested in our climate change conference, which is on Wednesday, the 10th of February from 9 o'clock to 5:30. We'll have Amber Rudd doing a keynote speech and lots of other excellent panels and conversations there. So thank you for the questions. Thanks again to the panel, and enjoy the rest of your day.